Richard Becker, welcome to Cindy Sheehans Soapbox.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for inviting me.
Well, a couple weeks ago, I had your partner Gloria La Riva on talking about what's really happening in Venezuela. And I read an article you wrote recently about what's going on in the Ukraine. So I thought it would be perfect to have you on to explain that. I just want to say that it appears to me that, we both know that the U.S. spends a lot of money, National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and other channels to undermine governments. And, I don't know if it was just a coincidence that it seems like what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening in the Ukraine came to a head at once. And so the U.S. is having two planned coups, happening, at the moment, or what's happening. And I'm going to give you the mic pretty soon, but also a lot of my friends who are deep into anti-imperialism and knowing that the U.S. government lies, they were immediately aware that something fishy was going on in Venezuela, but not so much in the Ukraine. And I think that's from years of anti-Soviet, anti-Russian conditioning. So what's your take on this, Richard?
Well, I think so, too. I mean, I think that there's been that conditioning, and the conditioning of public opinion is very important. And, as you say, a lot of people, and I know that a lot of probably the same people are from the same people with the same ideas who are less deceived about Venezuela than they are about Ukraine. But if you look objectively, if we think about what the leaders are saying to us, and it's very important to listen to what they're saying, not so much because what they're saying has any relationship to the truth, but because we then know what they're trying to get across and how they're trying to cultivate public opinion. So it's really, and some of it I think is pretty comical. I mean, to hear leaders like John Kerry and Barack Obama and, the leaders in the Congress talk about their great concern for sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Ukraine. Well, sovereignty is something they're very concerned about when it has to do with a country they're not planning to attack. But what makes it somewhat humorous, I think, the people around the world who I think are ridiculing this so-called concern for sovereignty is, you think back over the last 25 years or so, and you think of Grenada and Nicaragua and El Salvador, Panama, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Somalia, Yugoslavia again, Iraq again, Afghanistan, and up to the present time, the U.S. government has no concern about the sovereignty of countries like Pakistan or Somalia or Yemen when they want to attack people there with drones. The drone murders that go on every single day. So we can see, to start with, this is propaganda that's coming from Washington, and they have covered up the fact. And the corporate media, of course, is the way that they get this across to the population. Both the falsity of their so-called concern about sovereignty, but also the media has left out, and the politicians have, for the most part too, the fact that the new government that came about as a result of a coup with the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. State Department, John McCain, all participating directly, going there, being part of the demonstrations, that they brought into being a new so-called government, and that government we can establish, and this is, I think the article you were referring to on Liberation News, the Liberation News website, that we can point to at least 6 members of this new government, and maybe more, who are outright fascists. Mm-hmm. The new government is in a coalition between the far right the people who are willing, like the Prime Minister who met with in Washington, was hosted and hailed yesterday by Obama, Yatsenyuk, and it was a banker willing to do whatever the IMF wants, impose austerity on the country, and outright fascists from the Svoboda Party, which started out in 1991 as the Social National Party. You might notice the resemblance to the National Socialists, with the name of the Nazi, the actual name of the Nazi Party.
Right.
And the Right Sector, which is a group that's really a paramilitary group that was orchestrating a lot of the most violent attacks inside the Maidan Square. And so here we have, semi-fascist government, and I should add that these fascist elements have been given positions that some of the most critical positions in charge of the military, in charge of agriculture, as vice prime minister, and as the attorney general. They call it prosecutor general there. So very critical points in the government of the agencies that make up the core of the repressive state are now in their hands.
So what do the people in the Ukraine think about these fascists? And I just signed an answer petition, by the way, that says, tell Congress no support for neo-Nazis in Ukraine. What do the people there think about this so-called coup and the coup government?
Well, I think it's important to make the point that there's probably, there are many different views, I think, within the Ukraine. There are different national and ethnic groups. The Jewish community, I think the relatively small Jewish community, which was at one time very big but was wiped out by the Nazis to a very large degree, but there's still a substantial Jewish community there, are very much afraid of what this new government represents. And one of the leading rabbis of the country said that, Jewish people should leave based on what was happening and who was emerging ascendant in the protest movement there. So you have the Jewish community, the Ukrainian community, the Ukrainians, I think, are very divided between those who predominantly live in the West and those who live in the East. There's a large number of Russians and Russian speakers. There's Greek speakers. There's Crimean Tatars who are mostly Muslim, and there are very different views. But it's important to note that fascism, true fascism, classical fascism, does arise with a mass base. It's not just a small handful of people. And there is clearly a mass base, that does support the fascist elements. I don't think it's anywhere near the majority of the population, but it's a significant factor in this. And, it goes back to the time of World War II, and even before, and the time of the Russian Revolution and afterwards. But in World War II, there was something called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Union of Ukrainian nationalists. And the leading figure in that is a well-known man named Stefan Bandera. And they allied with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. They also carried out their own massacres of Poles and Jews and communists and others. They massacred tens of thousands of people. And the Svoboda Party, which has 5 or 6 positions in the new government, really traces its lineage to that organization, which was suppressed after World War II, continued to fight after World War II ended formally against the Soviet government, but it never went away. And so there is a basis in the population for fascism. There's also a very strong basis in the population, I think, who look back at the Soviet era as one where they had more rights, they had guarantees of health care and education and employment and so forth. And today, the Ukraine is in a deep crisis. But if you look at this history, in World War II, the Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people killed, right. About half civilian and half military. the U.S. lost about 400,000 people killed, which is a huge number. I don't mean to demean it in any way, but it's about 1.5% of what the Soviet casualties were in that war, and it was there that the Nazi war machine was destroyed. Was inside the former Soviet Union, and you can't have that kind of history without very large numbers of people in the population becoming extremely alarmed by a neo-fascist or semi-fascist government coming to power in Kiev.
So how does the Crimea fit into all this? Of course, if you listen to our corporate media and even non-corporate media, they're saying that Russia is invading Crimea and violating their sovereignty also. What's the real story behind that?
Well, the Crimea was part of Russia, both part of the Russian Empire and a naval base beginning in the 1680s, just quite some time ago. It was also part of Russia after the Russian Revolution of 1917, and when the Soviet Union was established in 1922, with 15 different republics eventually, the Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Federation, Soviet Socialist Federation. And it was only in 1954, so 60 years ago, that under Khrushchev, the Khrushchev government transferred the Crimea Peninsula from being part of the Russian Federation to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Federation, or Soviet Socialist Republic. And so that took place at that time, and the population was majority Russian at the time. I don't actually know what the motivation was for doing that, but in a certain way, it didn't make a huge difference, because while they were different republics, they were all within the same union. They were all within the same overall country.
Right.
So that's that's a much different situation than say, and the U.S. invading Iraq, the U.S. invading Afghanistan, the U.S. invading Vietnam, and other countries. I mean, this is an area that has a complex history in relation to both the Ukraine and Russia, and the idea that somehow, in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin, they just can't believe it. They just can't. They're just so outraged by the violation of Crimean sovereignty or Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, all of this, should be taken or seen as just propaganda that it totally is.
I don't know how true this is, but I was talking to someone who's very knowledgeable about world history, and he told me that Khrushchev gave the Crimea to the Ukraine at some banquet where he was drunk and everybody was drunk.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I mean, I think there probably had to be some other legal steps that were taken.
Well,
maybe there was such an announcement made. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Well, that definitely will have to be something that's verified. But didn't the Russians already have like a base and troops in the Crimea anyway?
Yeah, and that's there's an agreement,
right.
And they have the naval base at Sebastopol, and they have other bases in the country, and there are bases that are held by Ukrainian troops, and but there's a long-term agreement that I believe provides for 25,000 Russian troops or Russian military personnel to be there. I think that there was after the coming to power of this new government that's supported by the West, the government that we're talking about in Kiev, that there was great trepidation on the part of people, but also great trepidation on the part of the Russian government about what was happening. Because if we look at what's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was, at the time, when Gorbachev first acceded to the West and to the United States and to really cut off the relationship, withdrew the relationship with the Eastern European countries and the governments that collapsed there. And then the fall of the Soviet Union itself in December 25th, 1991, it was dissolved. There was supposedly some understanding that NATO wasn't going to try to incorporate all these countries into NATO. And of course, that's what they've been on the march to do. What they're really, they have incorporated several of those Eastern European countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact are now in NATO. Others are affiliated with NATO in another way without being full members. There clearly is a desire to bring the Ukraine into the European Union and into NATO, meaning that it would put the NATO forces, NATO bases right up against Russia. And Russia is seen as a power that in Washington, like China, that they want to bring down. They want regime change there. They'd like to break them up and to make them more easily digestible. And that's really what is driving this. Not any concerns about, morality or sovereignty or tyranny or dictatorship, any of those things. Those are all the things that we heard about. We've heard about so many other interventions, but clearly the geostrategic interest is in isolating and weakening Russia and China in order to sustain over a long period of time the U.S. strategy of global domination.
So, what do you think are the prospects, or what will be the outcome? How do you think Putin, the president of Russia, or the prime minister, whichever one he is, I'm not sure, will, how do you think he's handling this crisis, and what are we in store for?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I think that there are suggestions that there could be a compromise. You heard Obama yesterday after he met with Yatsenyuk in Washington, saying that if the Russians continue on this course, we and our allies will be forced to impose costs on them. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is more of this arrogant, garbage, but, how come there's no cost? The United States can invade countries on completely false pretenses like Iraq, and there's never any discussion about the international community imposing costs on the United States. But you get this, so they want to, if things continue along this road, and if, say, the referendum that's going to take place in the Crimea ends up with Crimea voting to join Russia and the Russian government accepts it, then probably there will be severe economic sanctions, or at least there may be. Although there's a big division between the United States and its European allies based on the difference in the importance of their economic relationship with Russia, with the Europeans having much more important economic relations. Mm-hmm. There could be a compromise. There could be an escalation. And we have been following this very carefully, and I think other people have too. But we're not predicting this. But if the military confrontation were to escalate, we're talking about the two of the powers who are involved in this are the ones that have the most nuclear weapons in the world. And you can't forget that.
Right.
But so I think that it's hard to predict. You can see why Russia might want a compromise solution, not to go into be facing severe economic sanctions and perhaps other actions. But they also, I think, see this as something akin to a life and death issue. That you're being surrounded, you're being the countries that are closest to you have been, and used to be your allies, have been turned into bases against you, and that's something that I don't think any government that's not a puppet, and certainly this government isn't a puppet government by any means. It's a nationalist government in Russia that no government can really find acceptable.
All right. Well, Richard, thank you so much for filling me and my listeners in on this important, so I don't even want to say important is not really even the word, but to give us some background and history about what's happening. And can you tell my listeners where they can get more information about this? I will post a link to the petition I signed earlier from ANSWER and a link to your article on Liberation News. But just tell my listeners your website and how they could get more information.
Well, Liberation News, and it's all spelled out, liberationnews.org, has several analytical articles on the current situation, and there will be more very soon, about the situation there, about the motivations of the United States and its allies, about the character of the government in detail. LiberationNews.org is a very good site, and of course, AnswerCoalition.org, and that's all spelled out as well. And I think I would just add that, I think all the listeners should be prepared. All your listeners, everyone who's hearing this, should be prepared to go into the streets to take action if the situation escalates, and it looks like it escalates toward the possibility of military action.
So terrifying. It seems like we've always lived in this world, and we really have to work more closely together to try to end the U.S. empire, because of course it's the biggest threat to peace and justice in the world today.
There's no question about that.
Well, Richard Becker, thank you so much for being on Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.